2 years after the start of the pandemic, Latin America, which had been previously making progress on various fronts in terms of poverty reduction, improved literacy, health and food security, is now being regularly cited in some of the most alarming global crises forecasts. The region, representing 8% of the global population, accounted for a third of COVID deaths. It took a big economic and social hit due to government measures taken to try to stem the pandemic spread, including strict lockdowns, with many people losing their jobs in the informal sector, as well as through the ripple effect of the slowdown in the formal sector. In 2020, the region's economy contracted by nearly 7.5%, as opposed to being down by 3.5% globally. Now, inflation, accelerated by the Ukraine crisis, is adding to those woes. The UN Regional Economic Commission, ECLAC, or CEPAL in Spanish, recently said poverty will rise to 33% this year versus 2021, when it was 30%, with extreme poverty reaching 14.5%. This is already the world's most unequal region, where the richest 1% of the population holds almost a quarter of total income, and the poorest 20 have only 5% of the income. The World Food Program in June, meanwhile, forecasts severe food insecurity rising from 9.7 million in Latin America and the Caribbean, already up 1.6 million since December, to 14 million by the end of the year. And in the region with some of the longest school closures, a recent joint report by the World Bank, UNESCO, and UNICEF said that 4 out of 5 sixth graders in the region will not be able to understand a simple text, something that is expected to further contribute to kids not being able to achieve their utmost and rising poverty in their lifetime. Earlier this year, as Matt mentioned, in its annual 10 Crises to Watch Out For, TNH forewarned that turbulent politics coinciding with increasing needs may complicate response to those growing needs. Megan, you are based in Colombia, where you have been covering the effects of the pandemic on various levels. Can you tell us a bit about how the impact has played out on people's lives in terms of the economic downturn in various parts of the country, including in areas where the state may be less present and where you might have been seeing a rise in conflict, as well as in politics with the presidential election just having taken place?
Absolutely. So, and this isn't just Colombia, right? Like, basically the pandemic, in similar to like a lot of places in the world, it's just rippled to every facet of society. The capital one is the economy, but you also see a ripple out to like access to health resources, armed conflict, migration, all of these big topics in the region that are always kind of being talked about have been massively affected by the pandemic. But what we're seeing right now is really just like the economic fallout of it in a lot of ways. So, this is a region that was growing economically and really building something for itself. You talk to a lot of sources here who, were previously living in poverty and have kind of been able to pull themselves out to be in the middle class and kind of advance their lives in some way, that just get slammed down again and are still dealing with the long-term fallout of that. And especially with inflation and all this stuff, it really just comes down to like not being able to put food on the table. So with this election, it's very interesting because previously Colombia has been about like war and peace, and it still is, but really this election came down to like people not being able to make ends meet economically. So like in Latin America alone, 4.7 million people were pushed out of the middle class and into poverty or vulnerability, according to the World Bank. And a big thing that's really happening right now, and you're seeing this with like the these protests that are beginning to break out in a lot of these countries, is like it's this balance that no one really knows how to like walk the line of, in terms of like inflation, and a lot of these economies are having emerging debt crises, and they're having to, you know, balance budgets and figure out how to pay back loans, which would, you know, prompt like measures leaning more towards austerity. At the same time, all of these populations and these people are demanding, you know, things like subsidies, and just, you know, basically demanding that their governments take care of them when it's incredibly complex. And this is kind of the result that you're seeing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you know, you touched upon a few of those, the issues that we've seen in countries also where there's perhaps an absence of democracy. I mean, we just had we just published a story yesterday on the situation in Venezuela, where during COVID, people have also been losing their lives. Obviously, the country has been in a phase of a spiral phase of, you know, economic downturn for a number of years because of mismanagement of the economy, as well as the sanctions that have been imposed by the U.S. But in this story, we did discuss the issue of growing malnutrition in the country, as well as other health issues for children, just as health workers have been leaving with 6 million other Venezuelans the country in the last few years. But the scenario that you described, you know, we see that happening in, you know, throughout the region, where incumbent governments have been voted out. Is that not right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, here in Colombia is the greatest example of this. You see this right-wing government that was historically unpopular. And, you know, Colombia is the conservative stronghold in Latin America. It's always been conservative, largely due to the armed conflict and fighting these leftist guerrilla groups and this alliance with the US. And it just elected a leftist president who was a former insurgent. And the key is that, you know, here is a president that was campaigning really heavily on like catering to the larger population in the country, especially facets that have been historically neglected, especially under this previous government. And, you know, it's not just Colombia. You see Chile with Gabriel Boric, and this proposal of a new constitution that includes like indigenous communities, and again, catering to like the larger population. You see different manifestations on that because, you know, this is a deeply diverse region too. You have Pedro Castillo in Peru, who's had a very troubled government, but was also elected as an outsider. And, you know, and then, for instance, in Brazil, you like Lula certainly isn't an outsider. He was president previously, but he is a massive shift from what Bolsonaro is in that country, and he has a very strong likelihood of getting elected. So you get a mixed bag, as diverse as the region all of these dynamics are placed in. And lots have been, you know, describing it as a leftist wave. And, you know, there is something to that, because a lot of these leftist leaders have like proposed social programs. But really, more than anything, I think it's like these populations seeking out something that's different from what they know, and what they know isn't working for them.
Yeah, well, actually, you know, as you said, I think the big factor in a lot of these elections has been the impact of COVID. In the case of Peru, which was actually the worst hit country globally in terms of COVID deaths per population, Castillo actually won in the midst of the pandemic, largely because of his support from the poor and indigenous populations, where you had immunization that was, really slow to come initially, and which generally had been neglected over decades, centuries, and where they saw the government, previous governments that were controlled by potentially wealthy elites or corrupt individuals, this potential in Castillo to be reversed by their vote. So in a country like Peru, which has in the past seen some of the highest economic growth rates due to mineral exports, many of the regions in the country continue to be cut off from social services such as regular health care and quality education, and people just wanted more. But political infighting within Congress in Peru and the acute government instability, which has seen a rotating door of ministers, has meant that many needed social programs, who have needed social programs, have had these social programs, have had difficulty to get going within government. So also historically, Peru has had an extremely centralized government decision making, which has in itself, the whole process, in the way that it works, has historically slowed the distribution of these needed funds, where you have a pot of money that's basically available for regions to apply for, but some of these regions don't actually basically stick their hand up to say we do need these funds. So what we also saw, this playing out in a mixed disaster that began at the end of 2021, involving earthquakes and landslides in the Amazonas region, where in the end the government was rather timid in its response. We actually did a story on disaster response where we discussed that issue. In late March and April, in Peru, large protests against fuel and food price increases also took place, paralyzing roads and blocking merchandise from getting to the markets. But the social unrest and anti-inflation protests also occurred in Ecuador.
Yeah. And just to note, specifically with what you say about the centralized government, that is kind of a truth for much of the region, right? Like you see it in Colombia too. You see all of these decisions being made in Bogota by people who don't understand these deeply complex regions. And a lot of these communities that lack connectivity and all of that stuff because of lack of investment by the government, they don't really have the opportunity to raise their hand and advocate for themselves. And you're seeing that now. You're seeing these kind of populations advocating for themselves. And you see it even in the previous election, where the voters on the fringes of this country were really the ones that handed Gustavo Petro, the leftist ex-insurgent, the presidency. And it's similar to social unrest in Ecuador, which basically it was started due to rising fuel prices and, inflation fueled by the global economic crisis and Ukraine. But, it seems strange for mass demonstrations that turned violent. They were taking over entire cities in the Amazon region, for instance. Why is that sparking such mass protests? And it's not because they're angry about fuel prices, but rather they're angry about, these rising inequalities, not being able to put food on the table and not feeling like cared for by their own governments. And in Ecuador, the thing that's really interesting and has been interesting to me while covering it is like, in a lot of these protests, like for instance, in Colombia with the Paro Nacional last year, those started and blew up in big cities in Bogota and Cali. Here in Ecuador, you have a case that it is largely indigenous led, and it really took off not in Quito, the capital, but rather on the fringes of the country, where you're seeing a lot of these things happen, and a lot of like poverty and all of these, again, really big questions playing out there, and then encroaching on the capital. I think it says a lot about what's happening in the region.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the indigenous movements. We're actually seeing, I think, an empowerment of indigenous movements throughout the region. In Ecuador, as you mentioned, in Peru as well, where communities have been calling out to have a greater say in, for instance, massive mining projects in the southern part of the country, blocking roads. I mean, there were roads that were blocked for a very long time, but also in Chile, where the indigenous communities have been represented in the rewriting of the Constitution. We've also seen this even at a global scale at the climate summits, where in Glasgow last year there were they actually they really had a place on the table. I mean, not literally, but they were there, and their presence was very much felt in the outcome of the conference.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes, sorry, please.
Oh, no, go ahead. Sorry.
So, but we, as we're saying, we haven't really seen the end of this political turbulence. You mentioned earlier the upcoming elections in Brazil, where its own experience through COVID of rising hunger and poverty is setting the stage for a face-off between the former leftist president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Jair Bolsonaro, whose handling of the pandemic has been much criticized. Among those issues were the government's slow vaccination rollout amid the spreading of fake news by Bolsonaro himself, and the handling during the pandemic of indigenous communities that have been under threat due to spiraling deforestation by ranchers and miners invading their land. You actually reported on vaccination in the Brazilian Amazon. So tell us a bit about what you saw and how politics and disinformation may have gotten in the way of the response to the emergency. It might be difficult to understand how people were so influenced by the fake news when this was a country that until recent years had a good reputation for vaccination and receptiveness to medicine by the population.
Yeah, so my story was one kind of similar to a lot of the things we've touched on about these global ripple effects that the pandemic has had. So I wasn't even focused on COVID vaccination entirely. It was more about the outbreaks of these completely preventable diseases. In the case of Brazil, measles, and other places in the world, you see polio and other things in a resurgence. And basically how that really falls in line with a lot of these government policies, where it wasn't just disinformation in Brazil, interestingly enough. It's like, really, when it comes down to it, because this is a country that has had a world-renowned vaccination program for decades, knocked out all of these diseases. And during the Bolsonaro government, you had a rollback in funding of a lot of these organizations that were really strong and would go out and vaccinate these like deeply rural communities. And when I was there, it was really interesting talking to, for instance, the regional health minister, because basically they told me, and this is specifically with the managing of the COVID-19 pandemic, where they felt completely abandoned by the Bolsonaro government, they told me, and they formed their own group to figure out how to handle, like, for instance, outbreaks of like measles, and like how to tackle all these things, because it wasn't a priority by the national government. And they had to figure out how to go about it in regions that are like very indigenous and are also deeply complex. They can be quite violent because as these people are traveling out, it's also overlaid with like illegal gold mining and all of these other things that have really flourished under the Bolsonaro government. So you kind of see, again, here's a case where communities, a lot of times indigenous, on the fringes of society, being abandoned, and like people trying to pick up the scraps and figure out how to fix that situation. So, and part of it was a lot of disinformation by the government. A lot of people told me straight up, like, he's like basically taking away like confidence in the COVID-19 vaccine, and that ripples to all vaccines. But it can be very complex, because it's not just that, it's also this government not prioritizing certain things, mixed with just like, again, lack of access to health services, no one going into health services, especially those that believe in vaccines and believe in COVID, because they just view it as dangerous, or they did, at least in the first early years of the pandemic, just because of how bad COVID-19 was in Brazil.
Yeah. So actually, we at TNH, we covered at a very early stage in May 2020 how COVID took off in remote indigenous communities in Brazil. That was actually a pretty interesting story to put together, given the travel restrictions. But we reported on how many deaths they were in urban areas as well, which in particular were not officially counted by FUNAI, the state agency responsible for the indigenous affairs, where Bolsonaro had put an evangelical leader to head it. We actually put the health of the indigenous communities in the Amazon basin as a central theme for our regional reporting during the pandemic. Another issue now is the striking rise of hunger in Brazil, nearly 20 years after the country had been removed from the FAO hunger map. Government food aid in recent years has dropped sharply to nearly zero under Bolsonaro. But ahead of the November elections, the president appears to be politicizing its response through various cash support programs, such as the Auxílio Brasil, introduced in November. But even the recipients of that aid are experiencing food insecurity. Another issue that got worse in the region has been the rising violence, particularly from illegal armed groups and gang violence, that have filled the void left by the authorities during the lockdowns. We've seen it in Brazil, in the favelas, in Central America, Mexico, and Colombia. How much of a priority is this to the new government to tackle this issue, and how do you think it will go forward? How do you think it will go forward in tackling it?
Yeah, so for a bit of context, all of these illegal armed groups are incredibly innovative. And basically what you saw from the very beginning of the pandemic, you had these groups basically taking advantage of rising vulnerabilities. So, with lockdowns, you had armed groups in Colombia, Mexico, and a lot of different regions imposing their own lockdowns on populations to exert and expand their power in strategic regions. Now, you see a lot of child recruitment. You see vulnerable migrant populations, in the case of Colombia, being pulled into the production of coca, the plant that creates cocaine. And in the case of Central America, because I work on U.S. migration quite a bit too, like in Guatemala, what I found was like the price to migrate has skyrocketed, and it's been going up for years and years. But when I went back, people were telling me that migrants were having to pay up to $16,000 to $18,000 to migrate to the US. And these are people that, take out loans. And basically what you see are these groups that are taking advantage of like migration north and this need to migrate north because of poverty. And it most affecting the most vulnerable populations. So in Colombia, and then, in the case of El Salvador, you have gang crackdowns, which also leads to other human rights crises. But in Colombia, the response has historically been militaristic to stuff like this, fighting armed groups with a strong hand that also produces, historically speaking, other human rights crises along the way, because it's war. What you're seeing now is this new leader, Petro, kind of wanting to take a different swing at it. And you're not just seeing Petro, you're also seeing like his other competitors during the election proposing similar policies. You have, less militaristic solutions and more focused on reforms, like negotiating with Colombia's biggest guerrilla group now, the ELN, which would have never happened under like previous right-wing governments. There had been like touches and like maybe this will happen, but it never really came to pass. And then instead of like fumigating coca here in Colombia, what you're seeing is like searching for different policies to really address these issues, again in a similar way that we've talked about. It's like these approaches haven't historically worked in this region, and now you're seeing this new government come in and want to try and tackle it from a different perspective. And we don't know if it's going to work yet, because it's a deeply complex region, but this is the proposal being laid forward.
Yeah, I mean, there is a game plan that is the accords from the peace accords from 2016, which recent governments haven't really been following in terms of the implementation of the social reforms that are required to help the communities that were affected by the conflicts. Let's talk a bit about gender-based violence, which you wrote about, and we worked on an investigation together, which reported on how difficult it was to get aid to women in need. First, as women don't feel that they can necessarily report violence to the authorities, followed by limited resources and at hand from the state and NGOs. You were in Cucuta near the Venezuelan border, speaking to women who experience both armed conflict and gender violence. What are the needs of these women? What sort of aid is there to respond to those needs?
Yeah, and here's the thing that has been historically the case, but you have migrant women who and come to Colombia, and they again get taken advantage of a lot of times by armed groups because they're kind of in the shadows and they don't have any access to like real aid. So and what you see, and not just on the Venezuela border, but in other parts of Colombia where I traveled to with you guys as well, is just the organizations doing the most and working with the people the most in need are oftentimes the ones that are just have no resources and work on a shoestring budget and are just like trying to pull together. And they're the ones, that are one organization that I followed was like, blocks away from this illegal crossing between the Colombia and Venezuela border, where you have all these armed groups fighting out, and you have a lot of these women who just don't have access to the most basic resources. And this is already a problem pre-pandemic and just exploded in the pandemic with the rise of gender-based violence. And you see that stretching on. I believe one person in our story made a really good described it really well, where it's like, it's basically like a lot of these like lockdown measures and all of these things that were producing all this gender-based violence went away, but the gender-based violence continues because in its place there's economic need, and these women that are vulnerable and are being forced to put themselves in vulnerable situations like sex work with like armed groups and stuff, because they just have no other option, or have to stay in a relationship with domestic abuse, because the only other option for them is like be on the streets. And a lot of these international organizations that were supposed to, and like aid funds that were supposed to fill the gaps, what you saw on the ground is like the money still hasn't arrived yet, when we were there at least. So it's, again, a very complex problem that, like a lot of these issues in Latin America, disproportionately affects the people on the fringes of society.
Yeah, as you said, that was an interesting couple of pieces to work on together, and there was, as we mentioned, this announcement that was made by the UN that it was going to be reserving these funds for gender-based violence around the world, and as we found, it took months and months for these resources to be deployed to those very people that need it the most. So amid the multiple humanitarian emergencies in the region 2 years into COVID, there is also concern that as many of these countries which recently graduated to the ranks of middle-income countries, even though they continue to present serious social and economic disparities, that they will have less access to needed aid, both development and emergency funding. Such concerns have been aggravated with the Ukraine crisis and what we are already seeing as a sort of draining of aid from other crises towards that situation. Ahead of the conflict last year, Colombia did manage to secure quite a bit of funding to support the Venezuelan migration after announcing a 10-year PPT program to regularize the 1.8 million Venezuelans who were there. Do you see this policy and openness towards the migration changing with the new government?
Yeah, so this Duque policy essentially offering legal means to, like almost 2 million Venezuelans. By a lot of humanitarian sectors, it's considered probably the greatest humanitarian success of the Duque government, in which it's widely considered by observers not that successful in other realms. And what you see in the upcoming government is, again, this leader that is quite progressive. I don't forecast that much changing on that realm. I think the one conflict that you kind of have is like all of these, a rising xenophobia in a lot of these regions with migrant populations, because a lot of Colombians feel that they don't have, like, why is this government allocating all these resources to this migrant population when we are also starving? So you have a lot of those conflicts, and that's not going to be easy to just dissolve. That's going to continue on. But I think the changes that you're going to see under the Petro government are a lot of how Petro addresses armed conflict in key migratory routes. So like the Venezuela border where I was for you guys, or the Darien Gap where a lot of these migrants, like Haitian migrants and African migrants, try and migrate north. These are areas that are key trafficking routes as well, and deeply strategic to these armed groups like the ELN. And for instance, if Petro has proposed peace negotiations with the ELN, which could dial back conflict a great bit. And then he's also proposed reestablishing diplomatic relations with the Venezuelan government, and, you know, keeping the Venezuela border open, because previously, and what has happened for much of the pandemic, is like migrants will go to cross the Venezuela border, and instead of crossing this legal, largely safe passageway, you have them pushed into these dangerous trochas, or illegal passageways controlled by armed groups. And then you see violent conflict there. And that causes a humanitarian crisis, because it's these migrants that get caught in the crossfire. So hypothetically, a lot of these policies could also affect migrants in that way. But that is probably one of the only policies under the Petro government that I don't believe we're going to see that much radical change, in terms of like a government still keeping its arms relatively open to a migrant population, which is very rare, historically speaking, in the rest of the region.
Yeah.
We also had actually a recent story at the time of the election on the panoply of issues, humanitarian issues, that the incoming government will have to deal with. Perhaps you could share that, Matt. So further north, as we know, migration has once again become a geopolitical issue, with the U.S. still trying to exert influence on routes through Central America before governments reach the U.S. border in exchange for the promise of aid and or investment. Over the last few years, as migration flows have risen through the region, some national agencies have been overwhelmed, like Mexico's Comar, its sparsely resourced refugee agency, as more migrants have been asking for asylum there. With migration having become hemispheric following the COVID shock, so many regional nationalities on the move, policies promoted by the Biden government to promote safe migration have not convinced so many observers that they would have much of an impact. So finally, amid all this pretty dire situation that we're facing after 2 years of COVID, where climate change too, which we haven't really spoken that much about till now, is expected to have an impact on the region at so many levels. As a journalist, one may wonder if the future of the region may provide any bright spots. What gives you hope?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, especially coming from a place of covering crisis after crisis after crisis. And frankly, a lot of these crises are going to continue playing out. But again, you have a moment of change in Latin America in which a lot of populations are pushing back and demanding more from their governments, and really demanding that their rights, be seen and respected. And, speaking specifically on Colombia, like this time last year, the vibe in this country was so much different, because it was coming out of these violent Paro Nacional protests, clashes between the government and protesters. And it was just like not a very hopeful time. But now with this new government coming in, promising change, and we'll see if it happens. It's a complicated road forward. But it is the most hopeful I've seen the country in my 4 years here, because you're now seeing these leaders being elected that are prioritizing major things like social welfare, respecting the environment, trying to address armed conflict and migration in different ways. And, that's not just Colombia, it's a lot of different regions. But I think if we're talking about like hope for change for the future amid lots of populations in these countries, that's where you're seeing it right now. And that's way different from where we were a year ago, 2 years ago, even 4 years ago when I first arrived here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's and of course there we spoke about some of those movements, but also I guess women's movements too. There's we've seen a lot of energy there.
Yeah. Well, and then like I think I've talked to a lot of people, especially on the topic of gender-based violence, and like this thing was like these femicides and domestic violence that has always been really, really high in Latin America. I think one activist once told me like, this is like the gravest we've ever seen the situation, but now it's out in the open for everyone. And all of these social disparities and all these crises that were already kind of simmering in the region and were perhaps easily ignored by the governments, they're not so easily ignored anymore, and they're becoming big global issues. And yeah, you see a lot of these populations on the fringes of places like Colombia and other regions gaining a greater voice and demanding more, and just with hope for change now in a way they haven't seen.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So actually, I was just looking in the column here, in the chat, and there just, I don't know if anybody has any questions, if they could raise their hands. Otherwise, we did have a question from Roger about how to define the informal employment sector. So I don't know if you'd like to have a...
It's hard. I've done a lot of specifically like data reporting on this. And one thing, the trickiest thing I think is like every country kind of defines it differently, right? I would define informal employment as someone who, I guess like works informally, doesn't have like any sort of stability in their own life. And perhaps there are like some people that wouldn't necessarily, for instance, like in the case of Colombia, there's Rappi, these like delivery workers that get paid incredibly low and are like relatively unstable, but technically working for an organization. But what you see is like, these largely migrant labor dealing with the same conflicts that someone like a street vendor selling or someone selling gum on the street is, that, that's specifically, kind of what you would think about when you're like, oh, an informal worker, someone that's like working on the streets or doing like some sort of thing. But I think what we've seen is it's expanded a lot more, especially with the rise of like technology and stuff in the region. So I don't know if there's like even a good answer to that. I do think the definition should probably be expanded more generally, because I really do think much of the region works somewhat informally.
Yeah, I mean, you have, I would say that it's irregular work very often, precarious conditions for work, people not having contracts, any sort of security in employment, and very often, I mean, there are countries, I mean, you just mentioned, I mean, in Peru, a country that I know very well, the level of informal work has seemed to increased even over the last couple of years to 80% of the population. In many other countries, you have similar numbers, 60, 70, if not more. percent of the population. It's working basically with this uncertainty of knowing whether they will have that work and what sort of income they would have in next day, next week, next month, and so forth. And of course, because of this, are unable to invest in the longer term in their futures.
Just trying to see if there's some other questions.
There's a question there from Maricela asking if you have any comments on Mexico. You say it's a complex set of issues to face with an increasing number of internally displaced persons.
I mean, I think what you're seeing in Mexico is very similar and perhaps a more extreme version of what you're seeing in Colombia, or a more advanced version. You see a lot of these like armed groups or cartels like fracturing and generating more violence between themselves. And then you see a centralized area. You can live an amazing life in Mexico City in the same way as you can in Bogota, but then, take a flight a few hours and you have this really violent scenario. And you have a lot of these areas where there's just like not deep government presence or really like an adequate tackling of these issues. And again, what you see are like these populations getting caught in the crossfire. And yeah, I think it's again a case of like these groups being empowered by lack of government presence that has always kind of been there, but again was exacerbated by the pandemic.
Yeah, I think the case with Mexico is that, it depends on, of course, the perspective that people have of Mexico. I think that from the north in the U.S., the greatest interest and the greatest focus has been for forever on the issue of migration, and of course, that's just one element of this puzzle, this complex humanitarian puzzle. That is Mexico, which, as you said, there's you have those illegal groups, the traffickers and drug traffickers that are also now finding new business in smuggling people, as well as now this accumulation of migrants, which the country is having difficulty in dealing with. There's right now as well, as I mentioned earlier, the issue of many of these migrants who are unable to continue further north to the U.S., who have been asking for asylum in the country. So how is it that the government's going to deal with that? There's of course, very recent announcement following the meeting between the Mexican and U.S. presidents, in that Mexico is going to help the U.S. build this wall, which, of course, as we know, was one of the things that Donald Trump wanted. But what exactly that means, I think it's that may be perhaps a call for further assistance in Mexico. Yeah, there definitely, Mexico, I think, will be a country definitely to watch in the coming years because of this inability to control this violence, as well as the mounting migration and other humanitarian issues that have come as a result of COVID.
I don't think we have any other questions from the audience at this point. But if you do have any final questions that anyone would like to ask, then feel free. But if not, then I think I'll ask a question, and then we can. We're approaching about 5 minutes left. So my question really to both of you is, you both reported on this region extensively, and you're very aware of how media outlets cover the region. What do you think is maybe missing in some of the reporting about the region that you see from mainstream media, independent media, other outlets?
I think there's an inclination, and I understand why it exists, to paint the region in broad strokes, right? Because you see these massive trends and global issues playing out. But I do think it's important. So, like for instance, in an example in Colombia would be like at the beginning when there was the rise of the Rodolfo Hernandez, who's this businessman character, sketchy for various reasons, that was this close to taking the presidency and was known for just his filterless way of speaking, obviously similar to a certain leader, certain US leader that we knew, right? So people would essentially like have these headlines like the Trump of Colombia. And I do think it's okay to make those comparisons down the line, but Colombia is a very different country from the US in a lot of ways. And I think we as journalists owe it to the region and our readerships to strike nuance and not just make these broad stroke generalizations. And I understand why, because it can be quite hard sometimes, especially with like American audiences coming from an American, to get American audiences interested in the rest of the world. And how do you draw people into this like global coverage? But I do think it's important to recognize, and when talking about these issues, kind of report each country as its own entity and not make these like very overgeneralized parallels on what's happening. And perhaps more than anything, break out of this like centralized thinking of like very Eurocentric or US centric, but rather tell stories through the perspective of that region, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yes, many of the mainstream media publications tend to sort of focus on major disasters, and you'd see perhaps some coverage for a few days, or depending on it where it is, maybe for a bit longer. There's election coverage, or in the case of, for instance, Venezuela, if there, we saw a few years ago a little bit more interest in some of the humanitarian issues that the country was confronted with because of this, this political confrontation between Maduro and the opposition. But I guess, that's in the end, that's sort of what our role, what we're trying to do at the New Humanitarian is really to be there, when you don't have those major crises, and to sort of follow up and to be there before sometimes the mainstream media is reporting on some of these crises that then come to the attention of the rest of the world.